Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Manufacturing Talks. I'm Jim Vinosky, your host. I'm glad to be joined today by John Broadbent. He is a director and founder at a company over in Australia called Realize Potential, an Industry 4.0 and digital transformation manufacturing consultancy. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon for you, Jim, and good morning for me.
Yes, good morning tomorrow. In fact, I'm sure you get that a lot when you talk to Americans.
Yeah, people ask me for the lotto numbers.
What's going to happen? Yeah, I guess stock tips, that kind of thing. Very, very glad to have you on, because we, in talking beforehand, we were hitting on all these points that are your interests that are so closely aligned with what we cover here. So got a lot to talk about. Before we do, though, why don't you just tell us about yourself and how you got doing what you're doing today?
Wow. Started a mechanical engineering cadetship in 76. So this year, actually started manufacturing at the end of 75. So this is my 50th year in Australian and international manufacturing. But interestingly enough, in my early roles as a cadet, I took a deep interest in programming. And when PLCs, programmable logic controllers, finally emerged on the scene in the factory that I was working as a maintenance and projects engineer, young projects engineer, we didn't have anybody who was capable of doing the programming side. So I very quickly adapted into the automation space.
Yeah,
did some incredible projects, worked on DCSs, distributed control systems as well. So I became an absolute automation nut. A bit of a propeller head, I'm sure, at the time. And then ended up during the 90s building factories in Southeast Asia for an Australian building materials company. So we did work in Malaysia, China, then Thailand, and each project was about a year long. So got a huge amount of experience in the integration space. 2000, read a book called Who Moved My Cheese, and recognized my cheese pile was getting smaller. So we elevated the company that I had at the time called Millennium IT into a role where we became a distributor for a company out of Pennsylvania who had a very clever tool that allowed you to mine content in SCADAs, PLCs and other systems that didn't normally talk to each other and act basically as an integration hub.
Wow.
We brought that product into Australia in 2001. SAP acquired the company in the US in 2005, just as we were getting traction. So my company then had product and no pipeline because we lost our distributorship, and SAP Australia had product and no pipeline, and we had pipeline and no product. So I got an introduction to SAP here in Sydney, kicked their door in, and struck a deal where I would be their free pre-sales functional specialist that could then help them sell the product, but we would get the services work. And that's what happened. We did probably 10 to 12 major projects for the likes of BHP and Rio Tinto and other big organizations, food and beverage as well. And so we got a really good experience on how to integrate manufacturing data that we spent my life in, but putting it into meaningful context so that people could then use what they call buzzword actionable insights. And then in 2017, I left that business partnership to go out on my own again and founded Realize Potential, because I was recognizing that Australian manufacturing in particular was certainly behind the eight ball. I reckoned that probably 80 to 85% of our manufacturing was being done on already fully depreciated kit. Most companies were sweating their assets so much they were dripping. And so I wanted to encourage companies to consider the whole thing around Industry 4.0, but I didn't really understand much of its history and what it meant. So I spent the whole of 2018 in a very deep dive, understanding the features and benefits. I only realised that my first smart factory in 2011 for Coca-Cola complied with all the Industry 4 maturity phases, but we built it from the ground up as a greenfield site. So that was a big aha moment for me, and that then set me on the journey of helping other companies do the same.
Wow. That is a heck of a history, and it brings us right up to the next question. And I saw in looking at your information online and the stuff about realized potential, you've got the tagline that you're about future-proofing manufacturing. So tell us more about the company and how it delivers on that.
So organizations, I hearken it back to what they call the emergence of the second industrial revolution, which is the electrification. So we had mechanization in 1784 with what we call the industrial revolution and the weaving loom and steam. And then in 1870, Tesla and Edison were having an arm wrestle
right
between AC and DC, and Tesla won. And it's almost like looking at digital transformation and industry 4 today as being in the 1870s and said, oh, this electricity thing's newfangled, I'm going to stick with steam. And I think that's why Germany in 2011 coined the term Industry 4.0, because they could see that it was a convergence of, it was almost inevitable, because it was a convergence of three very different concepts in terms of cyber physical systems, which is basically your car's dashboard, where you take signals from somewhere and you put them into a form that we can consume them as humans, cloud computing, and the emergence of the industrial Internet of Things. Once those three converged, as Germany said, it was inevitable that we would then amalgamate those into the way to do things in a more modern context. And the biggest frustration I see is that the large majority of manufacturing people are what I call below the line knowledge workers. So the front office has had, 2 screens, 3 screens on their desks, access to SAP, Oracle, whatever your flavor of ERP is, and all that information pretty well at their fingertips. But the poor manufacturing people are still working off old time, untimely information, pieces of paper being passed around different layers of the plant, and equipment, as we said, that could be 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that isn't computerized and isn't able to be connected to a network to extract data from it. So I see a lot of factory-based operational people, production managers, engineering managers, operation managers, really struggling with getting the information they need when they need it in the form that they need it in to make good decisions. And so my view is that if we're going to become more sustainable across the board, then we have to learn how to do more with less. And that means using less energy, less raw materials, less people where appropriate, and minimizing waste and maximizing finished goods output.
Yeah. And it's the only way we in the developed world are going to be competitive anyway.
Absolutely. I mean, the Coca-Cola factory that I mentioned is run effectively on the factory floor by 5 people.
Yeah.
It's a fully integrated SAP to factory floor. There's 23 different systems in that organization, and the manufacturing hub sits in the middle and talks to all of those. So SAP is just one of the spokes, which means they can do upgrades and patching and service packs and all that sort of stuff. And as long as that link between the two is the same, or even if it changes, you don't have to change a plethora of background stuff to regression test. You simply have to make sure that the data being passed backwards and forwards along that pipe is the same. But if it changes, you just have to change one thing.
Yeah. Now you talked about companies over there in Australia sweating the assets so insanely. I would submit that we're, in very much the same boat here in America, where we're running aged systems and still loaded up with people, to your point, very manual approach and labor intensive. What are the biggest opportunities you see to modernize factories and bring that Industry 4.0 and digitalization to bear on becoming competitive in the global marketplace?
So if the analogy I often use is that you're driving your car, you have no dashboard, the windows are blacked out, the view in the rearview mirror is where you were a month ago, and the managing director or president is sitting in the passenger seat asking, "Are we there yet?"
That's a good
sadly,
visual.
And sadly, that's the way most manufacturing businesses are running.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
I'm in awe, to be honest, that so many organisations can continue to function like that and still stay in business. Because
Yeah.
if our CFOs, chief financial officers here, had any idea of how much money, I call it, being left on the table, I think they'd need a defibrillator in every boardroom.
Right. Well, and that I think is the huge disconnect is, I mean, I've been having this discussion with some executives over here just in the last few weeks about how whether it's private equity or corporations, they're so short-sighted, they don't want to put capital into manufacturing. And yet that means, to your point, that we've already been behind. Now we're falling farther and farther and farther behind.
And
How do
interestingly
you bridge
enough,
that gap?
if you look at the global consumption of robotics, purchasing of robotics,
Hmm.
we were sold the story in Australia that we had to move all our manufacturing offshore to Southeast Asia for us,
Hmm.
predominantly China, Malaysia, Thailand. Um, and in that offshoring, we did nothing more than export our inefficiency.
Right. Yeah.
And in doing that, we then lost our skill set. We lost supply chain issues, which certainly became self-evident during COVID. And it's made reshoring, the option of bringing that manufacturing back to Australia, much more difficult.
Mm.
You guys outsourced a lot of your manufacturing, as far as I'm aware, to sort of
Oh yeah,
Eastern Asia as well,
for sure.
across
Yeah.
the Pacific for you guys. And to bring that back to Australia, firstly, you can't now bring a 1980s piece of equipment that you move because of the inefficiency, because of the lower cost labour base overseas. Now that labour rates are starting to increase in those countries, you can't bring that 1980s piece of machinery back. So now you have to find new land, build a building, buy new equipment. Then you have to find the skills for people to run it.
Mhm.
And before we got on this call, we were talking quickly about reshoring. And I know that Trump's now in office and America's been talking about trying to do that.
Yep.
My concern for that is it's what I call chicken and egg.
Mhm.
The biggest issue is if we can't get the skills that we do have in the diminishing pool, there's going to be a supply and demand response to that. And therefore, the cost of labor is going to increase because there's such a scarcity in the STEM area, engineering area, tool making, all those skills. And we're not attracting young people anymore to manufacturing because I don't think we've made it sexy enough.
What are some other kind of focus areas that people ought to think about as they look at that digital transformation, whether it's in existing or in new?
Well, if we look at just simply looking at what I call the 4 phases of maturity or the 4 stages of maturity of Industry 4.0, the first one is being able to see the information on your factory floor without having to go to the piece of equipment and have a look. And the example that I use, Jim, that a lot of people are familiar with, particularly from the food and beverage industry, is a piece of equipment called a check weigher.
Mhm.
A check weigher weighs product as it travels across it and confirms that it's within certain weight tolerances. Now, in any factory that has a check weigher, I can go down to the check weigher and look at the display and watch the pack weights, see them going across. But Industry 4.0 is firstly being able to see that information away from the equipment. So if I then have that check weigher computerized and it's on a network and I can mine that check weigher for information, I can now start extracting those pack weights and, for example, put them into a trend or a statistical process control chart or a
Mhm.
database. I can do with it a process historian, I can do with it what I will. So let's assume I'm making a 500 gram jar of coffee. And in order to know that I'm making a 500 gram jar of coffee, I need a standard to measure it against. So the second step of Industry 4 is the context piece. It's like driving your car. I'm doing 60 kilometers an hour. But if I'm doing 60 on a motorway at 120 limit, I'm in trouble. And if I'm doing
Right.
60
Yep.
in a school zone, which is 40 kilometers an hour, I'm in trouble, but for different reasons.
Yep.
So we
For
need
sure.
context of that information in order to show us where we are. So we may then have the standard of that pack weight, the 500 grams coming from an ERP system, for example, like SAP, So we can now compare what we're measuring to what we should be. So that's the second
Right.
stage.
Yep.
The third stage is then going, well, based on the data that I'm collecting, that I now trust, and I now have a standard to measure it against, I could, for example, create a statistical process control chart that will show me through a proper sampling regime where my pack weights are and my natural variation. And as long as within my upper and lower control limits and my standard deviations, etc., happy days. But if a system then starts to go a little bit AWOL, I can see that I'm now starting to increase my pack weights over time. So I need to make a correction to the control system, and I can go and do that manually. And that's the level 3, or the third phase of maturity, which is predicting where the process is going to go. What a lot of people miss is that the fourth step is the only part of the Industry 4 journey where you then close the loop. So when you start to collect that data, for example, and you see that you're about to make out a specification product, the supervisory control system automatically makes the adjustment to, say, the filling system to put the product back into specification. And that's the optimize and adapt piece. And that's where AI and machine learning can really come of age.
Yep.
But I'm seeing organizations in manufacturing miss the seeing, the understanding, and the predicting piece, and going straight to market and going, oh, we want to go AI, we want to go AI. And it's like, hang on, guys, that's the last step. You've got to start at step 1 first to make sure you can connect to your equipment and get the data from it in the first place.
Right. Yeah. Hence your point about the lot of ground to cover if you're going to reshore.
Very much so. But what people don't realize, Jim, is that you can apply that Industry 4 4-staged approach to a single piece of equipment. And that's why I use the check weigher as the example, because you don't have to apply it to the whole company at once. You can apply it to individual pockets, and each one you do, you will improve your visibility and responsiveness. And what you effectively do is you shorten the time between an issue, a manufacturing issue, and the discovery of that issue. The classic example is ready meals. Someone goes to the supermarket, buys a ready meal, gets it home, looks inside and realizes what's on the pack is not what's in the pack. So they now take that back to the store for a refund, because it might be they bought butter chicken, but it's chicken satay and they have a peanut allergy. So there's a risk. And in Australia, 1/3 of recalls are for undeclared allergens. And I used to be quite confused by that and think, how would a company not know it's got particular allergens in its food? And it's not that it's undeclared. It's undeclared because it's wrongly packaged.
Right. Yep.
So the time between when that product was made and the time it was discovered on the shelf at a supermarket could be 2 weeks.
Yep.
If we have a inline packaging and label verification system using barcoding or 2D barcoding, cameras, for example, to look at the actual pack itself, knowing what to look for, the moment someone puts the wrong sleeve on the wrong product, the line stops. So we've still had the same issue, but we haven't waited 2 weeks to discover it. We've captured it a few seconds down the line. And that compression of time between incident and discovery is when that time is long, there's a significant loss of value. When the time is short, there's much less loss of value. And you can only do that through connectivity and integration.
Yep. Got it. Now, let me shift gears on you, because I know another thing that you focus on is leadership development and
Yes,
how that fits with all this too. So how does that kind of play with this modernization effort that you're trying to help lead?
there are a number of companies that I know of, and I'm sure it's the same in the US, where people at the factory floor level, again, the operational level, engineering managers, production managers, operations managers, have great ideas about what they could do if they had some funds, and they will start to run a proof of concept pilot. I'll come back to that in a sec. They will then hit an approval ceiling. Someone further up the food chain will look at that. Often people my age, what I call the grey-haired ceiling.
Good one.
And they'll suppress that. And so the company ends up multiple plants, around the country, and they end up stuck in what they call pilot purgatory. Firstly, proof of concepts are no longer required. We have been collecting data, storing it, displaying it, and disseminating it for 30 to 40 years. We know we can do that. What we need to show is can we have a proof of value? Because ultimately the president of finance, VP of finance, the CFO is going to have a look at that and say, yes, it's going to save us money. No, it's not. And they're going to sign the check.
Yep.
But the way that those projects are done when they're driven from the factory floor up is they will inevitably hit that ceiling. What needs to happen is that the leadership of the business needs to say, we don't have a strategy. We need a strategy for the next 3 to 5 years to know where we're going.
Mm-hmm.
And then give the mandate to the people who are going to do the actual work of implementing these projects and funds to be able to go and do that.
Yep.
So it's a top-down led but bottom-up delivery modality, if you like. And in fact, recently I was on a call with a large company here that I was talking about digital transformation, and the guy interrupted the call and he said, John, you're not really convincing me that this is a journey we need to take. And I went, hey, no, hang on a minute here. That's not my job. If your leadership isn't telling you that you need to digitally transform your business, it's of no consequence to me. That's not my job. That's the job of your leadership. I'm not here to convince you of anything.
Yep.
And therein lies the challenge. Most organizations don't have a strategy.
Yeah. And that point about the lower level leaders needing to help foster that. I mean, I can tell you straight up, on our side of the pond, it's very rare that you've got that kind of development.
Yes. And it was Hillary Clinton back in 2015, 16, I think it was, who coined the term quarterly capitalism. She read somewhere that Fortune 100, I think it was, CEOs were interviewed, and the question was, if you could make a decision today that would have significant impact, positive impact in your business in 2 years' time, but it took a penny off the stock price, would you do it? And they all said no.
Yep.
And Clinton, rang one of the CEOs she happened to know and goes, please explain. And he said, well, if I make a decision today and it takes a penny off the stock price, my head will roll.
Yep. Yeah.
So you can see how that Wall Street mentality is driving poor decision making with this almost quarterly capital cycle, and therefore long-term strategic thinking isn't happening. And I read only a few years ago, Jim, that Toyota's strategic plan, the long-term plan, is 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even conceive of that, but that's what they do. So Japanese investment, for example, is often very good at the long game, 10 to 20 years worth of thinking about where they're going to go. I worked with a company here a few years ago, and the return on investment requirement was 8 weeks.
Right. Yeah.
And they wondered why nothing got done.
Yeah. And it's very typical over here that capital projects aren't approved unless they pay off within a year or two, which is still ridiculous.
It's tough, really tough.
Yeah. Yep.
Because that level of low-hanging fruit has usually gone a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then,
well, and it's not setting you up to compete down the road.
No.
So yeah,
Kicking the
I
can.
applaud
Yep.
that approach. I don't necessarily have the answer on how we fix our corporations and our venture capitalists and all that, but at least we start talking about it, right?
I think it's important to raise it because there will be people out there listening to this, and maybe someone might go, actually, I do need to lead. I do need to understand where this organization, there's a classic line that says, when you don't know where you're going, any road will do.
Right. Yep.
And I'm staggered that so many organizations don't have a manufacturing transformation strategy.
And unfortunately, they don't have people who know manufacturing who have a voice even within the company leadership. In fact, I would submit that a lot of our supposed manufacturing leaders, if they ever knew much about manufacturing, they've been off the floor for so long they've forgotten it. But you look at Boeing, where it was the bean counters and the finance people who were kind of driving the bus, and you see that everywhere. And so Boeing's kind of that tip of the iceberg example of how things go seriously awry. But we're all in the same unfortunate boat to some degree.
We will have a COO, Chief Operating Officer, in a bank, heading up operations, but we won't have a COO in a manufacturing business. We'll have a CEO and a CFO. The CTO and CIO will often sit under the CFO. and the person usually isn't a head of manufacturing, but anybody who does head manufacturing is way down, literally, the food chain. And so they don't get a seat at the table.
So here's an interesting thing I've just come across recently. I talked to a lot of executives in private companies, and I've seen how they've been afraid to speak up about these things. And I actually just challenged one here recently, trying to get him to lend his voice. I was offering to, I do the manufacturing coverage for Forbes.com, and I wanted to write an article talking about it. He was talking about this very thing, the way that for him it was private equity companies that are buying up people in his sector and not investing in manufacturing. And I wanted him to talk about it. He wouldn't go public with it. So to some degree, we've all in manufacturing gotten in this defensive crouch over the last 2 or 3 decades, and we have to get out of it.
What really staggered me is I'm reasonably active on LinkedIn, and I did a video series a few years ago that sort of got me traction and reputation.
Yep.
Is that at the end of last year, someone that I know quite well opened a Centre of Excellence for 3D metal printing. And he said to me, hey, would you mind coming over for the opening? There'll be about 60 people there. And could you give us 10 minutes of your time to do a bit of a keynote and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Okay. I thought, well, what am I going to talk about? So I did a bit of research and discovered in Australia, for example, that in 1960, manufacturing contributed 30% to our GDP. In 1990, it was 14%. And in 2023 was 5.4%. That's an 80 to 85% reduction. After I'd finished my talk, many people in the audience came up and said, oh, thank you so much. You're speaking exactly what we believe is the issue, what needs to change, because we used to be a good manufacturing country. 2 days later, I decided to put a cheeky little post out onto LinkedIn where I showed the graph of that decline. And where I'd normally get anything between 800 to maybe 2,000 impressions, as they call it, and a few comments, this thing hit 45,000 impressions. It had, I think, about 40 or 50 reposts. It had probably nearly 200 comments. I was flat out just responding to the comments to this thing. And I sent the link to our Minister for Industry in the government and said, if you really want to check the pulse of Australian manufacturing, just read this damn thread. Right. It tells you everything you need to know.
And it shows that we're not alone in understanding where the problem lies. But unfortunately, there's still that hesitance of so many people in manufacturing to raise their voices about it.
Yes. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have any ears. And young engineers, I've done a few keynotes and workshops and bits and pieces, and I've lost count of the number of young engineers who've come up to me and said, how do we get past you old blokes? Because they've got these digital natives, have got these great ideas about machine learning and AI and vision and all this sort of stuff that they want to play, with. And my generation is and slightly younger are going, no, we don't need to do that. We've always done it this way. And it's not going to work. So when I mentioned before about robotics, if you look at the spread of robotic purchasing, we were sold the idea that, well, let's go to China, cheap labor, Southeast Asia. But China, I think, is the second or third biggest country for users of robots. Well, why would they be doing that if labor's so cheap?
Yeah, well, and they're doing it when their labor still is much cheaper than us, and yet here we are not even keeping pace. So
no, and
we got work to do.
Australia's in the top 20.
Yep. Another piece I want to hit on before we wrap up. Your book is about the plight of men, right?
Yes.
Which is a whole other topic I've covered, kind of interweaving with my manufacturing coverage and kind of separate. But I definitely want to hear your perspectives on, the state of men in the Western world today and what you think the needs are and what you propose we do.
So the original title was called Man Unplugged, Exploring the Inner Man, and it was published in 2014, and realised it was possibly a little bit esoteric. But during the last 10 to 12 years, I've been through significant personal growth, lost both parents, been through a divorce. My kids are growing up, so I've had to parent them through teenagehood. I've got a lot more involved in men's work. I run retreats both here and overseas for men, week-long events. And I decided it was time to do a bit of a rewrite. But this time I changed the tagline from Exploring the Inner Man to Secret Men's Business for Men and Those Who Love Them.
I like it.
And the reason I did that is because when a man, particularly through midlife, hits the wall, which typically happens in their 40s, we call it a midlife crisis, but it doesn't have to be. As men, we generally don't share what's happening for us. We keep that to ourselves, and we process inwardly, where women process outwardly through dialogue. So when a man then discovers something that is a positive for him in how to navigate that time, he doesn't share that with people, with other men, because he thinks, well, I'm just Robinson Crusoe because no one talks about this stuff. So a lot of what I've shared in the rewrite of the book is secret to men themselves.
Yep.
And I wanted to broaden its reach so that men, particularly in the Western world, could have a read. And I have someone just reviewed it the other week, and his comment to me, which will be on the book as a testimonial, was, it's the most male-friendly book I've ever read. So yes. I'm happy that it's landing the way that I wanted it to land. And it's really a guidebook for any man who wants to be a better man, and what gets in the way of us being able to do that, but certainly encouraging men to get out more, get more male friends, because loneliness for men is one of the biggest issues. Some of the forums that I'm on, there are men in the States, all over the world, saying, I don't have friends, I don't have friends, I don't have friends, but I want quality friends. I don't want the friends that go down to the pub or the bar and, just drink copious amounts of alcohol, or I want to have deep and meaningful conversations. But we seem to have lost the capacity to do that, and social media hasn't helped.
No, that's for sure. I couldn't agree with you more, though. And I'll have a link to your book in the show description, so I do highly recommend everyone check that out, because just based on what you're saying, I'm definitely getting a copy, and we'll be plugging it far and wide.
Thank you. It's about probably 2 to 3 months from publication.
Okay.
The website currently has the PDF and the audio of the original book from 2014. But I've got my good old trusty podcast mic, so I'll be sitting and doing a book read over the next few weeks to make sure the audio book is ready to go at launch as well.
Okay. So one last question then. What do you think the big opportunities for you are down the road?
Whether it's through manufacturing or whether it's through men's awareness, the biggest thing for me is advocacy. I'm an advocate for local manufacturing. I'm an advocate for education, and I'm an advocate for men to understand why we are as we are and what we can do to live more fulfilling lives. So all of those roles require me to be in a role of service. It took me until I got to my 50s to discover my purpose, and I realized that when I'm in a true role of service, I'm in my happy place. So as long as I can continue to do that, and the workshops that I run in Bali, a week long for men over 55 to step into the more formal role of eldership, and that's something that I've been embracing for the last 5 to 10 years, and for me that's going to continue, because I love being in that role. Feeds my soul.
Clearly I'm biased. We obviously have several areas where we're in violent agreement on things. So I'm glad you're out there doing that and advocating for things I care about too.
Well, and likewise for you, Jim. I know it's hard road, running up a podcast and getting guests, and being sometimes a bit of a voice in the wilderness. But the more voices in the wilderness, the less of a wilderness it is.
Well put. Yep. Any last points before we wrap up?
No, but it's interesting just for me to reflect that in a conversation with a guy from Montana about 6 months ago, he and I had a very similar conversation. He was waxing lyrical about the state of manufacturing in the US. I was like, well, UK, US, Canada, like, you know, it seems to be the bane of the Western world. But we either have to make a decision to do something about it or just get off the bus and become a services economy. And I'll go down screaming and fighting if that's the case.
I was just going to say, I'm not taking that sitting down, and I know you're not either. So we'll go down kicking and screaming if that's the way it's headed.
We will.
Good deal. Well, John Broadbent, thank you so much for being with us on Manufacturing Talks today.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate the opportunity.
And as always, thanks to you guys in the audience. You're why we're here. We're here every Tuesday and sometimes even more. So keep an eye out. We got more episodes coming with, more great guests. I can't say that they're all going to have, the violent agreement on things that we all care about that John does, but they're all going to be in violent agreement on at least something. So tune back in. We'll be here at Manufacturing Talks. And I'm Jim Vinosky signing off. So long.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.